Three, two, one. Hi, thanks for joining my Quad Tech Set presentation. My topic for this assignment was storytelling and identity. I'd really like my text set to explore how storytelling shapes identity, belonging, as well as a critical focus on American identity. But I'd like to do this through the lens of traditionally marginalized voices like Native American and Latinos. The essential questions that will anchor this unit and the conversations and discussions that I'll have with my students are how do stories shape who we are and how others see us? Why do people act like different versions of themselves in different spaces? Who gets to decide what it means to be American, and why are certain voices elevated and others marginalized? And then what happens when people are reduced to stereotypes or a single story? Thinking about the students I want to teach this with, the standards I want to cover, and kind of like what we're going to study. This is designed for a 10th grade English language arts class. I would probably front load this unit in the year, really to set a tone for the critical nature of the text and the learning that we're going to be doing throughout the year. And then from a standards perspective, I'd like to focus it across a few different standards. Some literature standards, looking at complex characters, how they develop, analyzing word choice, figurative language, and how that shapes meaning. Looking at structure within literature, from pacing, flashbacks, and how that contributes to meaning. And then analyzing an author's point of view, purpose, and the use of rhetoric to communicate a point. At a glance, there are 8 texts within this unit, and there are 2 target texts, which will be the first being the absolutely true diary of a part-time Indian. That is the primary target text that the unit will start on, and then there are associated texts with that. And then we will shift to the house on Mango Street, which will center the Latino voices and the associated text with that. But let's dive in. So target text number 1 is The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. If you're not familiar with this book, it is a coming-of-age story focused on the character Junior. It's semi-autobiographical, but it really does a good job of kind of elevating a Native American perspective that is not expected or not the traditional flattened or stereotypical narrative that we usually hear in the United States. There's a lot of exploration around identity, dual identity, the pressures of being both a Native American and assimilating to American culture and society. And I think this story will really do a good job of helping students examine how stories construct identity and then whose stories get to define America. For this assignment specifically, I'd like to focus on the chapter How to Fight Monsters, as I think this single chapter captures many of the larger themes contained within the book in a discrete little package, and it's nice. But to introduce this entire unit, I'd like to focus on the TED Talk video by writer Shimandi Adichie called The Danger of a Single Story. Okay, this TED Talk really frames the unit's focus on storytelling, identity, and representation, and really provides a clear watch out on how stereotypes, bias, and if a single narrative is so dominant that it is the only story we know about a people or a culture, then that becomes shorthand for who they are in your mind. I'd really like this text to open students' eyes to the dangers of a single story, to the dangers of stereotyping, as well as bias, and then get them to question whose voices are elevated and whose are marginalized. Why are only certain stories told? Why, when we think of certain peoples, do we only think of certain like one story or a specific stereotype? This will really also establish the critical lens that I want students to use across this entire unit. For activating background knowledge and really providing in-depth information that is important for understanding the context of the absolutely true diary of a part-time Indian, I'll be featuring the nonfiction book Stealing Little Moon by Dan Sasui Jones. This book really focuses on how American Indians and Native Americans were forced went through forced assimilation, especially in white boarding schools. This will really help students examine how dominant narratives can silence or even distort Indigenous voices through a very purposeful and I would say formulaic, strategic manner. This will help them connect the historical context of identity, belonging, and erasure, and then really kind of bring these essential questions, provide good context for the essential questions that I want to discuss. I think this also does a good job of positioning storytelling as a way to reclaim, preserve, and kind of redefine identity. Speaking of which, I think it will be very important to feature counter narratives in this unit that really tell the true Native American story from the perspective of Native Americans. The first I'd like to do is a visual text. It's actually a photo essay by Camille Shaman. She's an activist and photographer. This is also featured on a blog on the TED Fellows website. And this is a great visual counter narrative to the contemporary Native American identity. And it's all done through personal images, okay? Portraits that she has shot throughout a couple of years. The goal here is this really challenges outdated and stereotypical portrayals of Indigenous people. It shows them as present, diverse, living, and evolving. And it does a really good job of pinpointing the major issue in the United States, which is that like Native Americans are positioned as a people of history, not a contemporary people. We talk about them in history books. Most of the portrayals we see of them are very flat, ancient kind of stereotypes. And so Native American peoples are here today. They are, modern and diverse and evolving while still treasuring their past and their heritage. And so this really kind of shines a light on what Native Americans look like today. This will kind of extend the focus on whose stories are told, who tells them, and kind of show how representation shapes understanding. Very closely connected to this photo essay is the 562 Project by Matika Wilbur. This is a fantastic book. It's several videos, a website. It's an entire kind of project that's focused on the 562 federally recognized Native American tribes in North America. Now, this book, which is just beautiful, by the way, goes a little deeper than We Are Still Here. It also features portraits of Native Americans, but it also gives their individual stories in their own words, which I think is really intimate and personal, and it just makes you feel so connected to the people in the photos. This is a way to use visual storytelling to kind of reclaim Indigenous identity and then really challenge those dominant narratives. I also think it does both this and We Are Still Here do a great job of showing how visuals can tell stories, right? Storytelling isn't limited to words on a page. And so I'd like to feature this heavily. We'll go through several of the people who are featured within the book. And depending on where I'm teaching and what school and what location, there might be an opportunity to connect to the specific history of that area through one of the Indigenous tribes in Project 562. Okay, the second part of the unit will shift from Native American voices to Latino voices. And the target text for this part of the unit is The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. If you're not familiar, this is a vignette-style novel that explores identity through the experiences of a young Latina girl in Chicago. For the purpose of this unit, I would focus on the My Name vignette, which really does a good job of exploring culture, language, inheritance, and self-definition, but it also looks at dual identity. Sandra, talks about in this vignette, it's talked about what is beautiful about her name, not Sandra, but the character in the book, as well as what maybe she doesn't like as much from the perspective of the dominant American culture, right? So in that case, it's really interesting in how it shows that identity is shaped both by internal desires, your motivations, your values, how you define yourself, but also external perceptions and the fear of certain perceptions and how community and people around us, culture, shapes how we define ourselves. This centers Latino identity and kind of challenges, again, this is another counter narrative to the stereotypes in dominant American culture. I'd also use this to kind of connect to the focus of navigating multiple worlds, that essential question around why do we change who we are in different settings. I'd pair this with the informational text, The Latino Threat by Leo Chavez. This nonfiction book looks at the single stereotypical identity of the threat, or sorry, the Latino immigrant threat, right? It looks at media, political rhetoric, and cultural discourse around Latino identity, and really shows how that stereotype is socially constructed and reinforced at a systemic level. A lot of the issues that are in the country related to race and identity are systemic, but this almost feels very purposeful from the top down. I'm hoping this will give students a more analytical lens for studying identity, power, and representation, and really peel back the layers of how intrinsic a lot of this is, how strong and how forceful those flattened negative stereotypes can be, and the role they play in our lives. Again, this will connect the unit to who defines what American identity is, like who's in charge of saying who gets to be American, and then again, whose stories are diminished. Finally, I'd like to feature a really accessible poem by Pat Moore called Legal Alien. I actually have it featured over here on the left. It's so accessible that I can fit it on a slide. I'm hoping that this poem will help students make a personal connection to dual identity, belonging, and the experience of living between cultures. The population of my current classroom is 85% Latino. So I think this would speak really well and work really well in that context. And I see this struggle that my students face, the cognitive dissonance of how you define yourself, and then the way the world pushes back on that, right? The way society and culture push back on that. I'd also really like this to be an opportunity for students to make specific personal connections to identity and code switching, right? How we navigate multiple worlds and change who we are to succeed in those different worlds. I also think this is a great opportunity to show how short poetic language can reveal complex identity struggles. Poetry can be a doorway into really complex themes and ideas, but it's presented so simply. Again, this would connect to the unit's focus on whose stories are heard, simplified, or misunderstood. Okay, so that is the text. That is all eight texts. Again, two target text centering traditionally marginalized voices like Native Americans as well as Latinos. When I think about vocabulary for this unit, I've already read most of the text, and I'll just tell you there's a lot of meaty words in here. Examples would be like assimilationist, etc. Because there's so many meaty words, my vocabulary strategies really need to ensure that students engage deeply and that they have repeated exposure to the words. So for the first part of that, engaging deeply, I'm a big fan of the Marzano process or the strategies. This really asks students to kind of work with the words in a few different ways and really kind of get their hands dirty with the wet clay, right? They have to define the word, they have to visualize them, they have to discuss them, and then kind of make connections between texts. Again, this type of deep engagement with vocabulary words, I think goes a long way in helping students kind of define in their own mind what something means. Now, I'd like to pair that with a word wall because a word wall gives students that repeated exposure to complex words that they may not get otherwise just by doing the Marzano process. You really have to kind of interact with these words many times before they're truly understood and internalized. So we would kind of create a word wall together as I would make this a more organic and ongoing process as students encounter either words that we focused on in the Marzano process or just words that come out while we're reading. Let's get them on the wall and kind of define them. Maybe as a new word comes out, we'll then incorporate it into the Marzano process so that we can make sure that we're being consistent and engaging deeply with all of this language. In addition to vocabulary, I've also thought through before, during, and after reading comprehension strategies. And I think to keep things nice and tight, I'm a big fan of the collaborative strategic reading approach, which really covers before, during, and after. This is a four-step kind of process. The first step is before reading, students will preview the text, activate any background knowledge, and kind of identify key vocabulary or concepts. It's really important to give them a clear structure for when they're working with this. So I'd make sure to do that. Step two is the click and clunk. This is during reading. As they read, they would use click and clunk to monitor comprehension. A click is something that makes sense or connects to what they know, and a clunk would obviously be the opposite of that. That's an idea or word that causes confusion. When we identify the clunks, students will use fix-up strategies and collaborate with each other to kind of define those. At this point, any words uncovered in the clunk, we can put on the word wall. After each clunk, students would, move on to step three, which is like get the gist. This is when you generate a kind of a gist statement of the who and the what. That's like a really quick summary statement, or paraphrase, if you will, not summary, but like in your own words, kind of spit back to us what it is. Then they would then share that with their group members, kind of in this collaborative process. And then finally, as a wrap up, after reading, students would summarize key ideas, return to the essential question, and kind of connect the text to the larger themes. I think this approach would be really good in supporting students as they read some of these complex, especially the informational texts were fairly complex. And I'd like to use this with the Latino threat, potentially stealing Little Moon, and I think it would just give students a collaborative way to make sense of these really in-depth and complex texts, which also feature all those meaty vocabulary words I was just discussing. All right, in addition to before, during, and after reading comprehension strategies, I've also thought through writing to learn strategies. And I have two that have really stood out to me throughout this process. The first is the magnet summary writing. I really like this because, again, especially with the informational texts, which are really complex, this gives a really good process and approach for students to kind of visually think through and make a mind map on the connection between ideas and concepts within what they're reading. So, they would identify the magnet word, which is that central idea, and then they would identify attractor words, which are connected to it. I personally love this approach because you have to figure out the connection between the words to understand the concept as a whole. And I think that level of understanding just goes a little bit deeper than just defining things or stating a main idea. You have to understand the connections, and in doing so, I think you get a deeper understanding of the actual text. Um, and then finally, probably my most favorite writing approach or assignment there is the raft writing assignment. This is an acronym that stands for role, audience, form, and topic. I have used this very recently in a very successful way as both a writing to learn task, a formative assessment as well, and then a summative assessment as well. For this specifically, I'd probably use the raft assignment on the novels. I think it would be super powerful to have students either from the role of Junior's reservation classmates and friends like Rowdy or his Reardon classmates and friends, and then like to kind of unpack and define Junior's experience. So putting on those completely different hats, I think will help students go a little bit deeper in their thinking and kind of understanding of these kind of complex themes like belonging and stereotypes and assimilation. This should build more comprehension and empathy for the characters like Junior in the book, and would also be great prep for a more summative writing assignment at the end of any of this unit, or even speaking test for that matter. Uh, which is a nice segue into formative assessment data. I know I just said a summative at the end, but I think at this moment I'm just thinking about assessing for learning, assessing for understanding, and if I think through the comprehension and learning strategies that we just discussed, there's a lot of opportunities for formative assessment data. From a vocabulary perspective, the Marzano approach will show me, whether students can define key terms. But really not just define them, but kind of state them in their own words. Like, do students truly understand what those words mean and how they're working, or do they have a surface level comprehension? I think a word wall will be a great way of just tracking over time how many words we're having trouble with, as well as any sort of themes across the types of words that need to be defined. By having a very visual wall, we can assess like if there are trends across the words that we need to define. The before, during, and after, reading comprehension strategies, the CSR, will really go a long way in helping me assess whether students are understanding the text that they're reading, as well as assess their ability to discuss these concepts, right? And then, after reading, obviously I'll be able to understand if there are key ideas that they're not picking up on, if there's themes that they haven't quite gotten, and then how, whether or not students are ready and capable to kind of move on to the next text. I think ensuring that they understand and have gathered the important information from the previous text will be important before you move to the next. And then finally, the writing to learn assignments, especially the raft, really just give me a detailed understanding of each individual student's ability to connect back to the essential question, if they're picking up on the themes, and then any opportunities for reteaching, because I'll have a spectrum of writing that I can look at. I'll be able to understand if there are areas within certain texts that we need to go deeper on or concepts that we need to revisit. As a whole, I think this will give me a good sense for ensuring that the information and the critical thinking that I want the students to be doing is being done. Um, I, if I reflect on this process as a whole, I just have to say I love it. The entire time we've been working in the quad tech set approach, I keep thinking to myself how wonderful it is, how great it is to have a process and a kind of a framework for ensuring that I am activating the appropriate background knowledge, and hitting on all the comprehension that I want, and really going deep on a topic versus going deep on a text. I think to me that is the most important aspect of this approach is the deep engagement with a topic and the critical aspect that I can bring, the critical lens that we can bring to it. Um, I also just think, as just kind of double clicking on that, I don't think there's a better way to activate and engage students with text. Ensuring that we're providing visual text and accessible text, broadening the definition of what a text is so critical in this day and age. Students currently just think of text as books, so I want them to know that videos and media and blogs and photos, all of these things are a part of our text and a part of kind of storytelling that people do and the ways that they build identity. As a next step, I'd like to keep expanding on this unit. I'd like to add a third and a fourth dimension, which would all have their own quad set of texts. The third dimension would be political identity. So how do political actors build a public or build public perception through their own storytelling? And then brand identity. How do brands and products and companies position their services and themselves for success? Thank you all. I appreciate you stopping by this TED Talk on the Quad Tech set of storytelling and identity.